There's a lot of disruption and uncertainty for everyone in the world right now. We're not going to name every headline. We know our listeners are living it and whatever form that takes for them. What we are going to talk about today is how nature can provide guidance for leaders to find their footing when the ground seems like it keeps moving. You know, we've mentioned relaxed readiness before on this show, and it's something that horses do naturally. On today's episode of Leading with Instinct, we're going deeper on this capability because we think it might be the most important leadership capacity that you can develop right now. So let's get started.
This is the Leading with Instinct podcast, focusing on intuitive leadership and fostering deep team connections through equine experiential leadership development and coaching. Brought to you by KatieTheCoach.com and the collaboration partners. Now, here's your hosts, Katie Navarra-Bradley and Ginny Telego.
Well, hi, Katie. It's good to see you. How are you today?
I'm well, Ginny. This is the first time we've connected in a while, so it's so good to see you as well.
I'm looking forward to this episode today, and also I want to just have an open and honest acknowledgement as we are recording this today. This is kind of where the topic came from in a couple of different ways. A lot of people that are listening know that we lost our home in an electrical fire 7 years ago. And back in March, I evacuated my horses for a wildfire that was close by. So there's another wildfire that's burning. Right now, it's probably the northern side of it is about 20 miles south of us. And this fire started 2 weeks ago today. It started out in the morning it was like maybe 3 or 4 acres that were burning. By the afternoon of that day, it was up to 2,500 acres. Within a couple of days, it was in the tens of thousands of acres. As of right now, today, that fire has burned over 98,000 acres. 351 people, I think, have lost their homes in this fire. Over 800 structures were burned in this fire. So those homes plus other buildings that people had, outbuildings, 4 businesses lost their properties. Right now, just across the West, there are multiple fires burning right now that continue to get larger. And so for us, I did evacuate my horses again a couple of weeks ago because the fire was starting to move very quickly towards our direction. And we weren't in any kind of a pre-evacuation zone, but the pre-evacuation zone was getting closer to us. And so 2 days after the fire started, I evacuated my horses to a ranch where I go, and just to give me some peace of mind. And it just brought to mind again the need for being relaxed and ready. When you live out here, wildfires are kind of a fact of life, especially now. It's been so dry out here for several years. This past winter, we had very little snow. And so the snowpack in the mountains now is very low. There's none in some areas of the mountains. And that's usually the water provider, right? During the spring and summer is the snow melting off the mountains. And so with all of that happening and just, watching all of these things happening and having to think about it, right? Like my trailer is still parked, even though I brought my horses home a couple days ago, my trailer is still ready to go. Like I have hay and feed and all the things. I actually still have some of my suitcases that are packed and in the trailer of things I don't need right now, but clothes and things like that. So that on a moment's notice, if we need to move, we can. And so as I was thinking about the ideas for our conversation today, the horses just kept making me think about how they stay in this state of relaxed readiness. Because when I went to move my horses a week and a half ago, they didn't know what was going on. They're just sauntering around the pasture. But what I do know is that while it looked like they weren't ready to move, I know that if something changed in their environment that required them to respond quickly, I knew that they would be able to do that and they would know to do it. What I also really admire and what I have been practicing, particularly since I had to evacuate the first time, is developing that ability to not be reactive, but to be relaxed and ready. So what was really interesting, and I think what really spurred this for me to say, yes, this is the topic we need to talk about, is I got an email from a colleague of ours who also does equine assisted coaching. Her name is Nicole Burkholzer, and she's in the upper Northeast, and she sent out her newsletter, that she sends out to people that subscribe for her, and she was talking about a trip that she had taken to Africa, and she was talking about her observations of a lioness out with her cubs and how she was practicing this capability of being relaxed and ready. So it looked like she was just laying around, and just not paying any attention. But Nicole shared, if you really observed her, and Nicole is a brilliant observer of the animals, she said you could see that she was very aware of what was happening around her. And she actually used that phrase of being in this state of relaxed readiness. I read that and I was like, okay, well, that clearly is the topic that we need to talk about. So I felt like it was the universe validating the importance of this topic. But, so Katie, as I kind of lay that framework and context, what are your thoughts when I said, hey, let's have this conversation?
Yeah, I was really glad that you brought this up because this was a term that was new to me since we've really started working on our podcast together. And also, having my horses here on the property now for almost 2 years, I've gotten to observe a lot more than you get to see when you go visit them at somebody else's barn or you're out, and about with them. And it reminded me, as you're telling this story, it reminded me of somebody else's video I saw on Facebook. I think they were down in Georgia, and all of a sudden, like a huge windstorm, came up, and they're videoing their horses. They shouldn't have been out on their porch. And they're like, maybe I shouldn't be standing out here, but I have to watch my horses. And the 5 horses were a lot calmer than we are as humans. And you can hear her saying in the background, oh, I wish I had put them in before the storm. And they really were just grazing. They did get closer together when a big tree snapped. They did kind of spook a little bit, make sure that things around them were still safe. And then they went back to grazing, which we're going to talk about here. And it's really interesting to dive into this conversation today and also to see the flip side of it. We've talked in several episodes about my horse Leroy having had a bad experience at a trainer. And you can he's really become much better than he was. We've gotten some other more positive help, and he's learning how to be a horse again. But it's very funny to watch him respond, I would say, more similarly sometimes to us as humans, where he's a little bit more reactive than some of the others. But he's starting to, read some cues from the others in his small little herd to help find that point where we're not constantly living on edge.
Yes, I think that's really interesting. And I guess that kind of leads us, let's paint a picture of what we mean when we talk about this idea of relaxed readiness. In my world right now, it looks like this idea of when there are wildfires happening, we have a system of there's 3 stages of readiness. And so the first stage is just kind of like, be aware that there's fires happening fairly close by, just something you want to be starting to make sure that you're thinking about having what you need ready to go. Then we have stage 2, which is pre-evacuation. So in pre-evacuation, they tell you, have everything you need ready to go. Because it could be that in a moment's notice, you're going to get the level 3 go now order. And so, this idea of sort of the stage 1 is really sort of the relaxed and readiness stage to me. Stage 2 is ready. Stage 3 is move, right? and so, I watch my horses while they're out in their pasture. They don't have any grass, but they have and they have little bits of alfalfa growing up in through the dirt, so they're kind of nibbling around on things. They're just happily walking, or they're napping in the sun because they do that every day. And people who don't understand how horses operate in the world often label horses as being lazy, right? Because they don't look like they're doing anything, which is so interesting because that is our human construct, right? If you are resting, you may be considered lazy, like you need to be doing something all the time. And so we don't take rest when we need to. That's another podcast, probably.
Right.
The truth is, though, that in those moments for the horses when they're eating or even when they're napping, they aren't doing anything besides what is needed in that moment. And so to say that they're being lazy really is a misnomer, because while they're doing those things, even when they're napping, you see their ears are moving around. If there are other horses, one horse is laying down and napping, the other horse is standing and watching what's happening in the environment. And so at a moment's notice, if there is a disruption in the environment, and it may not be close, it may be, several miles away that there's a disruption. There's a sudden sound, maybe something, there's a movement that happens. In my neighborhood, oftentimes there'll be somebody all of a sudden is just driving down the road in their utility vehicle, right, in their ATV vehicle. And my horses notice that because they see something moving off in the distance down the road. And so, their head comes up, they look at what's happening, and then they start discerning. That discernment, right, is whether to decide, is this disruption something I need to respond to or not? And then even if they do respond to it, they respond. And then as soon as they realize that they don't need to be responding anymore, they go back to grazing. And so that return to grazing, it's not an indifference and it's not laziness. It's really a very sophisticated regulatory behavior that animals have. And why is because they know they need to conserve their energy. And so they know if they constantly are in this threat mode, they're going to be exhausted, and then they can't respond to a real threat that happens. And so, Katie, I'm really curious as we're in the conversation to hear more about this with Leroy and kind of how you're starting to notice him returning to his instinct, right, which is to only use the energy needed to respond to the current reality. But also, I know you've talked about this to HR audiences, specifically this idea of how horses return to grazing after disruption. And that disruption might also be a conversation between horses, which
Right.
sometimes involves teeth and feet when they're having a conversation about something together. So I'm curious of, how can you share about what you're noticing about Leroy, but also what you're sharing with people in audiences when you're having this conversation and why it lands. Because I know you've mentioned to me that when you've talked about this, you've had people come up to you afterwards and really tell you how powerful that concept is. So, I would love to hear more about that.
Yeah, it's really interesting because this was the concept that I didn't necessarily think would land with audiences as strongly as it has. And so when I'm talking about this in presentations, I always start with the human side. And I always ask people, I don't ask them to call themselves out, but I kind of frame it as, I'm assuming that I'm not the only person in the room that really thinks about that conversation for days, weeks, months after, stewing on what was said, what didn't get finished, all of that. And people can relate to that, whether they're in HR or, they're at any level of the organization. And not only is the getting back to grazing about conserving their energy, but the more anxious a horse is, it leads to other health issues, right? It can create ulcers in horses, which can be very expensive if you own a horse. Ulcers can be very expensive to treat and lead to even stronger health issues. And so I then take that a step further. When we stew on these things, we then can get closer to burnout. I share that I was in a position before I created my own company full time that I really thought something was wrong with me seriously, digestively. And the minute I started stepping back and allowing myself not to stew on those conversations, all of a sudden things like started resetting. And, I see that even in Leroy, who he's still also, I think partly some genetics. He's cowbred, so he's, made to scan the environment, but a much healthier, more relaxed horse in more settings now that we're allowing him time to just be a horse. The funny thing is we do call him our more pampered horse, even though during the day they are out and they have free access to grass all day long. He prefers to stand in the shed, whether that's because of just the bugs or because he's still not 100% comfortable. I'm not sure. I'm going with bugs.
Right.
But even, even for him, being able to stand alone in the shed now is a big deal because he now trusts his own instincts a little bit more. He can relax. When he first came home 2 years ago, he was just hyper vigilant everywhere, walking fence lines. If he couldn't see another one of the horses on the property, he would just go crazy. And now he can at least be independent and take that time to reset his energy, so that when he does really need it, he has it to pull upon.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, and I think that is a great example of what we're talking about here. And so, what is a state of relaxed readiness? Essentially, it's a state of calm alertness. That's really key. It's a calm alertness where you're fully present to what is happening, not what might happen. What might happen is reactivity. But being present to what is happening right now in this moment. It's around presencing, right? We've talked about that on the podcast. In this state, you're capable of responding when action is required, but then you're able to return to equilibrium after the disruption without ruminating on the threat, and expending a lot of energy imagining all the worst case scenarios that might happen. And this is a really important definition, I think, to understand, because relaxed readiness, again, is not, it's not that you're ignoring that there's things going on. It's not apathy. It really is a place of being aware of what's happening around you all the time, but not allowing your nervous system to be in a constant state of anxiety, right? So you're talking about Leroy walking the fence line and being nervous about that. And where are the other horses? And who's going to tell me if there's a threat happening? And is anybody paying attention? Because I think there's a lot of scary stuff happening. And so, when you look at that in comparison to a horse who has the ability to do what's natural and be in this state of being relaxed and ready, it's a very different picture, right? So I know with my horses, like I had to evacuate my horses, like I was sharing earlier, and I went to the ranch that we were at before, and we went out into the same paddock. It's kind of a bigger paddock area, not as big as their pasture area, but it's a pretty big paddock. And so that's where I put them when I first got there because it was familiar. And they settled in much more quickly this time than they did the last time. However, my gelding, who is my lead stallion of the herd, right? He was walking the perimeter because that's what horses do. Anytime you put them in a new environment, they're going to walk the perimeter. They're like, okay, I got to know what's happening around here. It's like you're going into a new job, new organization, and you're like, I need to get kind of the lay of the land. Then I can focus on what I need to do. And so it took a little while, but eventually, within a fairly, by the next morning, they were much more settled. And they were eating the hay. They were eating hay. They had eaten their dinner. They weren't nervous. And so I really appreciated that demonstration of, okay, we needed to be in a little bit higher state of alertness when we got here last night. And also, though, Wager recognizes, because this is why he is a lead horse, is because he was able to regulate himself and not spend all night and still be pacing around in the morning when I got out there. And so it's not an absence of feeling uncomfortable in disruption and uncertainty. It is an ability to notice that something is happening, discern the level of that threat, if there is one, respond to it, and then release and go back to grazing, which is allowing your nervous system to just come back to a place of equilibrium and normal. And so this is what we're trying to do. But Katie, what are the alternative states that we as humans and certainly leaders experience this, but what do we normally do that's not relaxed readiness?
Well, of course, we're hyper vigilant, right? We're always looking for that next challenge. It's on the horizon, wondering if the efforts that we're putting into something are going to pay off, and worrying about something that hasn't even happened yet. We tend to catastrophize the what ifs. What could happen if I do this, or I do that, or I don't do this, or I don't do that. We also have that avoidance shutdown where we just can't process what's going on. And that ruminating, that I mentioned earlier, just that constant playing and replaying what has happened before. And that can weigh on our mental health, our physical health, in all aspects of life. And, one of the other things that I, talk about when we talk about get back to grazing, it's really interesting. I gave one of these presentations, and Jennifer Massey, who is local to me, known as a very large HR consulting and training company, came up to me after one of those presentations. We've been getting to know each other through the years, and she says, we have the perfect, if you want to collaborate, we have the perfect program we could put together. I could put it around my HR framework. We can use both of our audiences to promote this event, but she goes, of all the things we really have to cover, they get back to grazing. And she says, because as business leaders, as senior leaders, even aside from the hypervigilance, we never take time to actually appreciate where we are in the moment. And so we've built a whole program around ending with a get back to grazing activity where we spend 10, 15 minutes of just literally sitting with the horses or sitting on the patio, and the participants are asked to write down their thoughts. What happened in the day? What stood out for them? How are they feeling at the end of the event versus the beginning of the event? In the last session that we did 2 weeks ago, it was very interesting. We had one of the participants say, I built my business this time around to be intentional, where I don't have to be a part of the business all the time. He goes, I was in one of those businesses and missed out on a lot of life, and I've built this company so that I can come and do a program like this and not be worried about what's going on back at headquarters. And he said the horses, through this get back to grazing, really helped him realize we just have to enjoy every day that we get, and that we're lucky that we have them to enjoy. Not that life won't have its challenges and business won't have its challenges, but we don't take a lot of this time to just, take that pause and, like our horses, get back to grazing.
Well, and I think that's such a great example of, why we do the work that we do. And I know I have the same thing happen when people come out and just realizing how, like, watching the horse, maybe within an activity, or even if we're doing a herd observation, they might watch the horses all of a sudden respond to something, right? Some shift that happens in the environment, and maybe the horses, trot or run away for a moment, but then how quickly they come back together, or watching a couple of horses have a conversation, and then they just come back, and the next thing they're nose to nose eating. And people are so fascinated by that because we don't operate that way, and so as we were preparing for this episode, I, of course, am always thinking about the neuroscience of these things. And I know, Katie, you found some really cool information and research about why our brains don't necessarily help us with being in a state of relaxed readiness. And I'm curious to know what you found.
Yeah, really fortunate. I get to work with people who study neuroscience and write about it a lot. And, unfortunately, our human brain is wired with a negativity bias. We tend to always be fatalists in what we see. Not that some people haven't overcome that more than others, but generally speaking, we've evolved to give more weight to the threats than to feeling in that neutral or positive state of thinking. And, it started legitimately way back, before we as humans had houses to live in. There was a lot to consider versus survival, but that's just not the same reality that we have in our corporate boardrooms today or our organizational team meeting spots.
Yeah.
And that has caused us as a culture to have a lot of chronic stress and just this sustained hypervigilance. And I worked on a thought leadership piece earlier this year. Actually, it was a 2-series piece about burnout and why CEOs experience burnout more than others, and how it affects them differently than others. And it really impairs the decision-making ability. Somebody who was really able to make decisions quickly and confidently, when they get stuck in this hypervigilance, they start questioning every decision that's made. And then there's this feeling of control, and that trickling down to every decision. And it can really take a toll on our teams. Our teams can feel disjointed, feels like maybe their input isn't valued as much, and productivity just declines. There's also, this is true both in horses and people, but that emotional contagion is real and it's quick. We see it. A horse sees danger, they respond. The other horses in the herd respond too. I heard one neuroscientist tell me the fastest way for us as humans to offload stress is to pass it on to somebody else.
Yeah.
So for us as individuals,
that was great. I'm happy to do that.
Yeah, that's the best way for us to get rid of stress. Well, what does that then do to everybody else in the chain who that trickles down to? And so finding ways to be able to manage difficult situations, whether they're ongoing, long-term situations until we can get them under control, or these very short-term, to your point, uncertainty coming every day, finding ways to be able to get back to that relaxed state of readiness for ourselves and for those that we lead.
Well, and I, was just thinking about you talking about the emotional contagion piece and passing the stress on. And I think that's a great example of where we could actually reduce our stress and rumination by stepping into sometimes uncomfortable conversations, right? We put it off because we don't want to have that uncomfortableness. But at the end of the day, if you step into it and then you realize that there can be some difficult conversation, and then both people can make a choice to go back to grazing, right? Because with the horses, when horses have a conversation that sometimes, again, may look kind of scary to us as humans, when they have that level of conversation, there's a reason for it. It's not out of just, I'm going to just be a jerk to you. If two horses are having that level of a conversation, it's because there is something that needs to happen in order for the herd as a whole to stay safe, right? Because horses' primary objective is always health, harmony, unity of the herd and self-preservation. But their self-preservation is part of the whole herd being safe. Their self-preservation is not from an individualistic perspective of just, I don't care what happens to you, Katie, as long as I'm safe. Mm-hmm. And so, I think if we start to include that thought process of understanding that we do have the ability to go back to grazing and to come back to a place of calm and equilibrium, so that we then can be ready for the next things. And I think it is important to understand that when we don't develop this ability to be in a place of being relaxed and ready, and we continue to carry the disruption and chaos that we're experiencing forward rather than finding a healthy way to release it, it impacts our ability to make good decisions, because our brain, there's a whole neuroscience piece of this, of when our brain is overstimulated and how we can't make good decisions because we're not able to look at things more broadly. We get very narrow focused. Psychological safety drops with people, right? If I'm in a place of high stress and I haven't developed the ability to manage that in a healthy way, it's going to come out to those around me. And then trust is going to erode, right? And people are going to get burned out. And man, Katie, you and I have talked about this before, of working for people who didn't have the ability to regulate, and how exhausting it is to be with that person and be in the space with that, because you're waiting for the next thing, or you're waiting for the next burst of crisis that might not actually be happening. And so just, your description of that, I think, is really spot on.
Yeah, I think we could probably all share some of those stories. We've kind of talked about this, I don't want to say abstractly because we're using some of our horse observations, but to help our listeners understand, how have you seen this play out in the arena with some of the sessions that you've facilitated?
Well, not too long ago, I worked with a small team of really high-performing leaders who wanted to use the experience with me and the horses to gain some additional awareness about themselves and how they can work better together. Now, they're already, again, a high-performing team and quite a bit of self-awareness. But a lot of the responsibilities were starting to evolve for them as a team due to strategic shifts in the organization as a whole. So they were wanting to kind of explore, what does this look like now going forward, right? Where do each of us fit to really utilize our strengths the most? And so when they were engaging with the horses in the ground activities, each person's energy came through very quickly, right? We have this saying in our work of how you do one thing is how you do most things. And that is exactly how it showed up. So one leader on the team had energy that was very clear, and also sometimes more than what was needed to influence movement in the moment. And so when this happened during the first team activity that they were doing, they had to move one horse. The horse was just loose in the indoor arena, and their task was to move that horse into a box made of 4 poles on the ground in the middle of the arena without touching the horse. So there was nothing on the horse. There was no halter and lead rope. The horse was free to choose whether or not to engage with them. And so as the one person's energy really was very like, we got to get this done. We got to get this done. We got to get this done. And the horse just kept moving more quickly away and moving more quickly away, going to the other side of the arena. And so then they would become more task focused. And the more task focused they came, the more the horse moved away from them. In reality, the horse was doing exactly what they were telling him to do. Their energy was saying, move, 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 right? But that really wasn't what they needed. They needed the horse to move some, but not to the extent that the horse was moving. And so they were really struggling to get the horse to go into that box. So we had some coaching and conversation around what they were noticing and what was happening. And we talked about their energy and where was their focus. And so they started regulating their energy, right? So when they would start to see when the horse started moving, I would coach them on, okay, now just keep your energy steady, right? Keep clarity of where you're going and keep energy steady. He doesn't need more energy right now. He just needs consistency. And so they really experimented with it. And then they realized that they didn't have to be ready to react all the time to what the horse was doing. That when they stepped back into this place of calm energy, they were able to notice more. And so then they were able to see small shifts that the horse would make. Like the horse maybe turned his head a little bit, and then they would realize that that's the direction the horse is going to go. And so then they could move themselves where they needed to go in order to continue guiding the horse and providing clear direction to him. And it was so interesting because they began to see that not being in reaction mode all the time was really what allowed them to accomplish the task. And as they each identified what they needed to do differently in order to be in a state of relaxed readiness, they were seeing how that was going to be super helpful to them when they went back to their work the next day, and be helpful to them as a team for them to really determine how do we utilize everyone's energy best. And the person who had the really strong energy, we began to have conversation about where is that most effective. And so it was really cool to watch.
As you were explaining that, I had a similar situation, not in the same ground-based activity, but one very similar, where two of the individuals had a little bit of they had a lot of horse experience, although the rest of the team did not. And their energy was, we're very much going to get this done, and we're going to get it done now. And the horse was responding to the people with the least amount of horse experience, who were really focused on the connection rather than the task. And it was very interesting, as you said, to play out once we all took a step back and they got some coaching through it. That horse was really, we also feel that there were perhaps some health issues, so we let that horse be, step back. But it was very interesting to see the horse interact with the completely different energy, to your point. And so being able to be able to respond and let things go, know when to walk away and when to come back, is very important.
I think that is so powerful, right? Is for us to really think about that, and actually carries us into one of the takeaways that we really want people to practice and understand is, a horse's superpower is their ability to release things fairly quickly. After a disruption in their environment, generally, if they have the opportunity to be able to release that in their own way, they don't hold on to it and just carry it. They assess, they respond, and then they return to this grazing place of their baseline. And so it's really about noticing when you're carrying something that the moment no longer requires you to carry. So that meeting that ended an hour ago, whether maybe a decision that was made, a disruption that's already passed, are you still holding on to that? And if so, why? And is it really beneficial to you to hold on to it? It may be.
It may be. And, to your point of returning to that baseline, horses do this so well. They have that built-in reset. And as leaders, we, need to work on ours as well. So what I also tell people in that presentation is, we might not be able to eat 24/7 like horses, but can we find that reset that works for us? Whether it's a breathing exercise or taking a walk, or asking ourselves, what do I need to know for certain right now? And what is actually in front of me versus what am I thinking might be there?
Yes. And I think that also then goes into our third takeaway of being able to recognize for yourself as a leader, how do you respond physiologically to disruption, especially if it's sustained disruption. So I encourage, when I'm coaching leaders, I teach them, we practice in our coaching sessions, them noticing what happens in their body when there is a disruption, or when something happens in a meeting, or whatever that is. I get them paying attention because they've not paid attention before. They don't realize that something in their body responds before the rest of it happens. And so if we can start to pay attention before the next high stakes meeting that you have, or maybe before a difficult conversation, or, if you're in a leadership role and you need to give an organizational announcement about something that might not be what people want to hear, pay attention to what you notice in your body in that moment, because that's an indication for you of what's happening. And you have the opportunity in that moment to just pause, recognize it, just notice what it is, acknowledge it. I actually have my clients to themselves say, thank you, brain and body, for sharing that information with me. But what you can do is it can help you get grounded in that moment. So it's not that you ignore it, but you recognize it. And so it gives you the opportunity to go into those situations from a place of calm, right, overall. And you can still go deal with it afterwards. If you come out and you need to express it, horses, this is what horses do. They go out, they might come out of a stressful situation, all of a sudden they'll have a burst of running, or they'll go and roll, or they make all these yawning, they do this yawning action. There's all kinds of things, but what horses know is they need to release that energy in order for them to be ready for whatever's coming next. And so the question for us as leaders is, how can we develop that ability ourselves so that we can model that for our people and be able to recognize that being in this place of relaxed readiness is not a weakness. It is not lazy. It's not apathy. It actually takes a lot of courage to be able to be in that place where you can, like for me with the fires, I need to be able to be in stage 1 and even be in stage 2 without panicking, right? I need to be able to be in pre-evacuation status without being in a panic. And what I noticed this last time when I had to evacuate Katie, my horses, when I went out to catch them this time, they were in the run-in shed. They stood right there while I put the halters on. We walked on, we got on the trailer. They were much less stressed on the trailer this time, and they settled in. I really truly believe that a lot of that was because I now was in that place of being able to say, I recognize there's something I need to pay attention to, but I don't need to use a level of energy that's going to make everybody panic.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Well, and that also goes into preparation too. You did not wait until the last minute.
Absolutely.
Which also
no,
helped.
You're true. That's true. Yes.
I was just going to say, as we, wrap up today, we keep coming back to this, talking about the grazing horse and it not being a lack of awareness of what's going on, but our ability to match the energy to the situation. And it's a choice that we have to make as leaders. We can do some of the same version of that without being totally consumed with the energy that's going on. So bottom line, Ginny, right? You don't have to have it all figured out. You just have to stay in a state where your best thinking can show up. And that is relaxed readiness. It's a practice that can get stronger every time you return back to it after a tense or stressful situation. So we hope that you as our listeners found our conversation helpful today. If so, please share it with others who you think would like to learn how to be in a place of relaxed readiness. And as always, until next time, stay grounded, stay connected, and always lead with instinct.
This has been the Leading with Instinct podcast, focusing on intuitive leadership and fostering deep team connections through equine experiential leadership development and coaching. The Leading with Instinct podcast is brought to you in partnership with the Collaboration Partners, harnessing the collective human potential in organizations since 2009, providing equine experiential learning for lasting change. Get in touch at thecollaborationpartners.com and by katiethecoach.com, helping entrepreneurs and business leaders reset, reconnect, and reframe. To live their best professional and personal lives. Visit katiethecoach.com for more information. For more information about equine experiential development and coaching and the Leading with Instinct podcast, visit www.leadingwithinstinct.com. The Leading with Instinct podcast is available at leadingwithinstinct.com, on the Leading with Instinct YouTube channel, and wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Subscribe today, and thank you for listening to the Leading with Instinct podcast.